He didn't just break her heart, he shattered her world. One moment, she was Isabel Rossi, an aspiring architect, cherished by the city's most powerful CEO, carrying his child, their future a skyscraper of dreams. The next, she was a pariah falsely accused of corporate espionage and cast out onto the cold, unforgiving streets of New York. He, Damien Blackwood, believed the lies, his voice like ice, as he told her he never wanted to see her again. 5 years later, a titan of industry has returned a woman forged in the fires of that betrayal. And now the ruthless CEO who destroyed her is about to discover the truth, and it will bring him to his knees, begging for a woman who no longer exists. The city lights of New York glittered below the penthouse apartment, a sprawling universe of possibilities that Isabel Rossi felt she held in the palm of her hand. From this vantage point, perched atop the Blackwood Tower, the world felt like a meticulously designed blueprint, and Damien Blackwood was its master architect. He stood behind her, his arms wrapped around her waist, his chin resting on her shoulder as they stared out at the urban galaxy. "It's beautiful, isn't it?" His voice was a low rumble, a sound that resonated deep within her chest. Every light, every building. It's a testament to ambition, to power. Isabel leaned back into his embrace, the scent of his expensive cologne and the crisp cotton of his shirt, a familiar comfort. "I see homes," she murmured, her fingers tracing the outline of a distant bridge on the condensation of the window. "I see millions of stories all happening at once." That was the difference between them. Damien saw power structures and assets. Isabel saw the soul within the steel and glass. She was a brilliant junior architect at his firm, Blackwood Holdings, a rising star whose innovative designs had begun to catch the eye of the industry. He was the CEO, a man who had inherited an empire and multiplied its worth with a terrifying blend of charisma and ruthlessness. Theirs was a whirlwind romance that had scandalized the city's elite and infuriated his board of directors. He was supposed to marry for alliance for legacy. Instead, he had chosen her, a girl with nothing but a scholarship degree, a brilliant mind, and a heart she had foolishly given him in its entirety. "My sentimental architect," he chuckled, his lips brushing her ear. "That's why I need you. You soften my edges." But his edges were precisely what his world demanded. That world was often on display at glittering galas and suffocating charity dinners where Isabel felt like a curiosity. It was at one of these events that the first cracks in their idyllic facade began to show. The air was thick with perfume and whispered judgments. At the center of the most powerful social circle was Chloe Vanderbilt, a woman sculpted from old money and sharp angles, her family's shipping dynasty entwined with the Blackwood legacy for generations. It was an open secret that she had always expected to be Miss Blackwood. Chloe drifted towards them, a champagne flute in her hand, her smile a slash of red lipstick that didn't reach her cold, calculating eyes. "Damien, darling," she purred pointedly, ignoring Isabel. "Father was just saying the Sterling Tower bid is a sure thing. Your competition doesn't stand a chance. We don't count our victories until the contracts are signed, Chloe." "You know that," Damien replied, his tone polite but firm. Chloe's eyes finally flickered to Isabel, a dismissive head-to-toe glance. "Of course. You must be learning so much about the business, dear," she said to Isabel, her voice laced with condescension. "It's all so complicated, numbers and strategies. Not quite as simple as drawing pretty pictures." Isabel felt a flush of anger, but forced a serene smile. "Architecture is about more than aesthetics, Chloe. It's about functionality, sustainability, and creating spaces that enhance people's lives. It's quite complex, actually." Damien's arm tightened around her, a gesture of support, but she saw the flicker of annoyance in his eyes. He hated public scenes, however subtle. He wanted her to be graceful, to float above the fray, not to engage. Later that night, as they undressed in the silent opulence of the penthouse, he was distant. "You shouldn't let her get to you," he said, unbuttoning his cuffs. "She was insulting my profession. And me. She's irrelevant," he stated, as if that solved everything. "Her opinion means nothing. Don't stoop to her level." But Chloe was not irrelevant. She was a constant, venomous presence, a reminder that Isabel was an outsider in Damien's world. She planted seeds of doubt, making casual remarks to Damien about Isabel's ambition, whispering to board members about the impropriety of the CEO dating a junior employee. Isabel felt the pressure mounting, the sense that she was walking on a tightrope, and the only thing keeping her from falling was Damien's hand. A few weeks later, Isabel had been feeling off. A wave of nausea in the morning, a persistent fatigue she blamed on the long hours she was putting into a new green energy library design. On a whim, during her lunch break, she bought a pregnancy test from a pharmacy downtown. Back in the sterile, anonymous bathroom of a coffee shop, she watched in disbelief as two pink lines appeared, stark and unequivocal. Pregnant. A tidal wave of emotions washed over her, fear, shock, but above all, a profound, soaring joy. A baby. Their baby. A piece of them, a new story to build together, a love made tangible. She imagined telling Damien, seeing the surprise, and then the slow, rare smile spread across his handsome face. This would solidify them. This would silence the whispers of Chloe and the disapproving board. This child would be the foundation of their future. She rushed home that evening, her heart thrumming with a nervous energy. She prepared his favorite meal, seared scallops with a lemon butter sauce, and placed the small positive pregnancy test inside a gift box on his pillow. She waited, her hands trembling slightly, for the sound of his key in the door. When he finally arrived, he looked tired, his brow furrowed with the stress of a deal gone wrong. He barely glanced at the perfectly set table. "Rough day?" she asked softly. "We lost the Henderson contract," he bit out, loosening his tie. "Peterson Global swooped in at the last minute. They knew our exact bid. It's like they had our playbook." He slammed his briefcase onto the marble countertop. "There's a leak in this company, and I'm going to find out who it is." His anger filled the room, a cold, oppressive force. Isabel's joyful bubble began to deflate. Maybe tonight wasn't the right time. Damien saw it. She started, but he was already walking towards the bedroom. "I just need a shower. I can't think about anything right now." She followed him, her courage wavering. "There's something on your pillow. I wanted to tell you." He saw the box, he picked it up. His expression unreadable, and opened it. He stared at the plastic test stick for a long silent moment. Isabel held her breath, her heart pounding against her ribs. She searched his face for joy, for surprise, for any emotion other than the cold mask that was slowly descending. Finally, he looked up, his grey eyes like chips of flint. He didn't smile. "Is this real?" he asked, his voice flat. "Yes," she whispered, her own smile faltering. "We're having a baby." He ran a hand through his dark hair, turning away from her to stare out the window again. The city lights seemed to mock her now. This complicates things, Isabel." The words were a physical blow. "Complicates things, Damien. This is wonderful news." "Is it?" He shot back, spinning to face her. The fury from his lost contract seemed to be merging with this new, shocking development. "We're in the middle of a corporate crisis. My position on the board is already being questioned because of our relationship. And now this..." Tears pricked her eyes. "This isn't a corporate crisis. This is our child." He sighed, the sound heavy with frustration. I need time to process this." He looked at her, and for a moment she saw a flicker of something else. Fear, perhaps. But it was gone as quickly as it came, replaced by the cool, calculating CEO. "We'll talk about it in the morning." He walked into the bathroom and closed the door. The click of the lock echoing the sudden terrifying closing of a door in her heart. She was left standing alone in the vast, silent bedroom, the forgotten dinner growing cold on the table, The positive pregnancy test, feeling less like a promise and more like a liability. The blueprint of their future, once so clear and bright, was now shrouded in an ominous, creeping shadow. And she didn't know that the architect of her impending ruin was already putting the final, devastating touches on her own design. The days that followed were suffocatingly tense. Damien was distant, immersed in his hunt for the corporate mole. He treated Isabel with a polite, cool detachment that was more painful than outright anger. The baby was a topic he refused to discuss, a silent, looming presence between them. Isabel's morning sickness was a bitter secret. She choked down each day, her joy curdling into a knot of anxiety in her stomach. She tried to tell herself he was just under pressure, that once he found the leak, he would come back to her, to them. Meanwhile, Chloe Vanderbilt saw her opportunity. She had been observing, waiting her jealousy, a patient predator. She had access influence and a complete lack of scruples. The leak Damien was so obsessed with. It was a ghost, a fabrication she had invented to set her stage. The initial lost deal was a minor one she had orchestrated through a contact at Peterson Global, a small price to pay to prime Damien's paranoia. Now it was time for the main act. She enlisted the help of Mark Renshaw, a disgruntled senior architect at Blackwood Holdings, who felt Isabel, with her meteoric rise, had stolen the promotion he deserved. Chloe's offer was simple and irresistible: help her frame Isabel, and she would ensure he was made lead on the upcoming career-defining Olympus project. Greed and resentment made Mark a willing pawn. The plan was cruelly brilliant in its simplicity. Mark began sending anonymous encrypted emails to a dummy corporation containing sensitive but slightly outdated blueprints from Blackwood Holdings. Then he used a burner phone to send a tip to Damien's head of security, hinting that the traitor was a rising star in the design department with a close personal connection to the CEO. Simultaneously, Chloe moved on her second front. She knew Isabel often met for coffee with an old university friend, Nathan, who now worked for a rival firm, Sterling Corp. It was an innocent friendship, but Chloe knew how to twist innocence into a weapon. She hired a private investigator to take photos. The pictures were expertly framed, a shared laugh that looked intimate. Isabel handing Nathan a tube of architectural drawings, which were actually just personal sketches for his new apartment. A friendly hug, goodbye that from the right angle looked like a clandestine embrace. The final piece was the bank transfer. Using a sophisticated series of offshore accounts, Chloe deposited $50,000 into Isabel's savings account, an account Isabel rarely checked. 1 week after Isabel had shared her news, the trap was sprung. Damien was in his office, a storm of controlled fury, when his head of security, a stern man named Peterson, laid a file on his desk. "Sir, we've traced the data breaches. They seem to originate from the junior design department's server block. And this." He pushed a series of glossy photographs across the mahogany desk. Damien stared at the images of Isabel and Nathan. His jaw clenched. He recognized Nathan as a senior designer from Sterling Corp, one of their fiercest competitors. "This could be anything, Peterson. A friendly coffee." "There's more," Sir Peterson said gravely. "We looked into her financials per your protocol for high-level security breaches. A payment of $50,000 was wired to her account 2 days ago from an untraceable offshore entity. On the same day, Sterling Corp mysteriously pulled out of the running for the municipal contract, leaving us with a clear path. It looks like a payment for insider information that forced a competitor to fold. Every piece of evidence was a perfectly cut stone, fitting together to build a fortress of lies around Isabel." Damien's mind, already primed by paranoia and the stress of the pregnancy announcement, saw the pattern immediately. The ambitious girl he'd taken from obscurity, her complex knowledge of the business she'd so pointedly mentioned to Chloe, the way she was suddenly having a baby, a development that would tie her to him, to his fortune forever. The betrayal felt absolute, a knife not in his back but straight through his chest. It confirmed his deepest fear, that he was being used, that her love was just another calculated move on the corporate chessboard. He didn't call her. He didn't wait. He drove straight to the penthouse, his heart a block of ice. Isabel was in the nursery. They had never discussed sketching ideas for a mobile to hang over a crib. She looked up when he entered, her face lighting up with a hopeful smile, thinking he was finally ready to talk, to be a father. "Damien, I was just thinking—" "Stop!" he commanded, his voice devoid of all warmth. He threw the folder of photographs onto the small table beside her. They scattered across her drawings of smiling moons and stars. She looked down, her brow furrowed in confusion. She saw pictures of herself and Nathan. "What is this? This is just me and Nate." "Nate from Sterling Corp." Damien sneered, his lip curling. "How much did they pay you, Isabel?" "Was $50,000 the going rate for our entire municipal strategy?" The accusation was so outlandish, so venomous, that she could only stare at him. "What are you talking about? Paid Damien, that's insane. Is it? Or is it insane to think I could trust you?" The girl who came from nothing suddenly, in my bed, in my company, and now conveniently carrying my child. He spat the word child, sounding like a curse. It was all a lie, wasn't it? Every word, every touch. Tears welled in her eyes as the horror of his words washed over her. "No, I love you. I would never." "Who told you this?" "The evidence tells me." He roared, his control finally snapping. He grabbed her arm, his grip bruising. "The photos. The money in your account. The intel we've been losing for weeks. It all points to you." "There's money in my account. I don't know anything about that," she sobbed, trying to pull away. "Damien, please, you have to believe me. Someone is setting me up. The only person setting anyone up here is you," he said, his voice dropping to a deadly whisper. He released her so abruptly, she stumbled back. "You set me up for the perfect fool." He looked at her, his eyes sweeping over her with utter contempt, lingering for a second on her still flat stomach. "I want you out. Now." "Damien, no," she begged, tears streaming down her face. "Our baby. I'm pregnant. Get rid of it," he said, the words falling like shards of glass. "I want nothing to do with you or anything that comes from you. You are nothing to me." The cruelty of it stole her breath. This was not the man she loved. This was a monster wearing his face. The love she had felt for him, fractured, then shattered into a million pieces. "Get out of my building," he continued, his voice chillingly calm, now that the dam of his rage had broken. "Your things will be sent to whatever gutter you crawl back to. Security will escort you out. If you ever try to contact me or claim that child is mine, I will use every ounce of my power to destroy you and prove you are an unfit, lying whore. Now get out." He turned his back on her, staring out the window at the empire he believed she had tried to compromise. Isabel stood frozen, the world tilting on its axis. The man she was going to build a family with had just disowned her and their unborn child based on a pile of lies. Security guards appeared at the door, their faces impassive. They didn't touch her, but their presence was a violation, an eviction from her own life. Numbly, she walked out of the apartment, leaving behind her clothes, her books, her entire life. She didn't have her wallet, just the phone in her pocket and the clothes she was wearing. As she was escorted through the gleaming lobby of Blackwood Holdings, the place where her dreams had taken flight, she saw Chloe Vanderbilt standing near the entrance, speaking to someone on her phone. Chloe looked up and their eyes met. For a fleeting second, Isabel saw a flash of triumphant, venomous victory in Chloe's gaze. And in that moment, Isabel understood. The serpent had not just whispered in Damien's ear, it had kissed him, and with that kiss, poisoned everything. As the cold night air hit her face and the heavy glass doors of the tower swung shut behind her, Isabel Rossi was no longer just heartbroken. She was erased. The streets of New York felt alien. The towering skyscrapers that had once inspired her now seemed to lean in, threatening to crush her. Isabel walked for hours, a ghost drifting through the bustling crowds, the city's symphony of sirens and chatter, a deafening roar in her ears. Each step was a testament to her new reality. She had nothing. No home, no job, no money, and the man she loved had become her greatest enemy. His final words, "Get rid of it," echoed in her mind, a cruel, relentless mantra of rejection. She ended up at a 24-hour diner, the fluorescent lights humming over cracked vinyl booths. She ordered a glass of water and sat there until the pre-dawn light began to filter through the greasy windows, her mind a maelstrom of pain and disbelief. How could he believe it? How could the love he professed, the future he had promised, be so fragile as to be annihilated by a handful of manufactured lies? The naivety of her own heart disgusted her. She had built her world on a foundation of sand, and the tide engineered by Chloe had washed it all away. Her first instinct was to fight to scream the truth from the rooftops. But Damien's threat hung over her like a guillotine. "I will destroy you." She had no doubt he would. He had the power, the resources, and now the conviction of a man betrayed. She was a penniless, disgraced architect against the Blackwood Empire. Any attempt to fight him would be a public crucifixion. And worse, it would put her unborn child in the crossfire. As the sun rose, a cold, hard resolve began to form in the pit of her stomach. She couldn't fight him head on. Not yet. But she would not obey his final, monstrous command. This baby, this tiny, innocent life inside her, was all she had left. It was not a complication. It was her reason, her purpose. She would not get rid of it. She would protect it. She would raise it far from the poison of Damien Blackwood and his world. Her only option was to disappear. She used her phone to sell the only thing of value she had on her, a delicate diamond necklace Damien had given her for her birthday. She found an online buyer who met her in a pawn shop, giving her a few $1,000s in cash, a fraction of its worth, but to Isabel, it was a lifeline. With that money, she bought a bus ticket, choosing a destination at random, a place where no one would know her name, Chicago. The bus ride was a blur of grimy windows and anonymous towns. With every mile that separated her from New York, Isabel felt a piece of her old self flaking away, leaving behind something raw and new. The heartbroken girl was being calcified by anger and a primal need to survive. Life in Chicago was brutal. She rented a tiny rundown room in a boarding house, the smell of damp and despair clinging to the walls. She found a menial job waitressing at a small diner, working grueling hours on her feet, hiding her growing belly for as long as she could. The physical toll was immense, but the emotional one was worse. At night, she would lie on her lumpy mattress, one hand on her stomach, and weep silent, bitter tears for the life she had lost. Yet, with every flutter and kick from within her, resolve hardened. This wasn't just for her anymore. Months passed. Her savings dwindled and her pregnancy became more pronounced. One rainy afternoon, seeking refuge in the public library, she found herself in the architecture section, her fingers ghosting over the spines of books that felt like relics from another life. She sat at a carrel, pulling out a notepad from her worn purse, and began to sketch. It started as a mindless doodle, but soon a design took shape, a fluid, innovative concept for a community arts center powered by kinetic energy from foot traffic. The act of designing was like taking a breath after being held underwater for too long. It was the one part of her they hadn't been able to take. A man paused by her table, his shadow falling over her drawing. "That's a remarkable concept," a quiet, raspy voice said. Isabel looked up, startled. He was an older gentleman, perhaps in his late 60s, with kind eyes behind thick-rimmed glasses and a tweed jacket that had seen better days. "I'm sorry, I was just—" She began instinctively covering her sketch. No, please," he said, gesturing to her notepad. "The use of piezoelectric generators in the flooring is bold. Most consider it too expensive for public works. But your integration into the primary structure as a load-bearing element, you're offsetting the cost. It's brilliant. She stared at him, stunned that he could decipher her rough drawing so precisely. You're an architect. He smiled faintly. I dabble. My name is Arthur Finch. The name hit Isabel like a bolt of lightning. Arthur Finch. He wasn't just an architect. He was a legend. A Pritzker Prize winner from the old school, famous for his rebellious human-centric designs that often clashed with the corporate-driven aesthetic of firms like Blackwood Holdings. He had been a vocal critic of Damien's father, and by extension, the entire Blackwood philosophy of architecture. Seeing the recognition in her eyes, he chuckled. It seems my reputation precedes me. He looked at her again, his gaze taking in her worn clothes and the weary exhaustion in her face. A mind like that shouldn't be sketching on scraps in a library. Where do you work? Isabel's throat went dry. I'm not working at the moment. In the field, I mean. Arthur's gaze was perceptive. He saw the flicker of pain, the deep-seated trauma behind her eyes. He didn't press. Instead, he pointed to the chair opposite her. May I, For the next hour they talked, not about her past, but about architecture, about form function and the soul of a building. He spoke with a passion she thought had been extinguished in herself. He saw the same fire in her buried under layers of ash. I have a small independent firm here in Chicago, he said, finally, as the library prepared to close. Finch and Associates. We value talent over pedigree. We're always looking for fresh perspectives. If you're interested, my door is open. He handed her a simple business card. Isabel looked at the card, then at the man who was offering her a chance. Not just at a job, but at reclaiming a part of herself she thought was dead. For the first time in months, a flicker of hope ignited within the embers of her despair. Taking the job was the beginning of her resurrection. Arthur became more than a boss. He was a mentor, a protector. He never asked about her past or the father of the child she was carrying. He simply gave her work, challenged her ideas, and treated her with a respect she had forgotten existed. When she gave birth to a healthy baby boy, with Damien's dark hair and her own determined eyes, Arthur was the one who visited her in the hospital. She named the boy Rowan, a name that signified strength and protection, like the tree. Holding him in her arms, she made a silent vow. He would want for nothing, he would be loved fiercely, and he would never ever know the name of the man who had ordered his existence erased. The next 5 years were a testament to her unyielding will. She poured her pain, her anger, and her thwarted love into her work. Under Arthur's guidance, her talent flourished, sharpened by a newfound edge of ruthless pragmatism. She wasn't the sentimental girl Damien had known. She was a creator, a businesswoman, and a mother. She climbed the ranks at Finch and Associates, her name becoming synonymous with groundbreaking, sustainable design. When Arthur Finch retired, he didn't just hand her the reins. He sold her the firm, which she rebranded, keeping his name as a sign of respect, Finch Rossi Designs. Isabel Rossi was gone. In her place stood Ms. Rossi, a formidable CO, a single mother, and one of the most sought-after architects in the country. She had risen from the ashes, not as a victim, but as a phoenix, her wings forged in the fires of betrayal, and she was about to fly straight back into the storm she had escaped. The London office of Finch Rossi Designs was a testament to Isabel's philosophy. Located in a repurposed Victorian warehouse, it was a soaring space of exposed brick, reclaimed timber, and living walls of green foliage. Sunlight streamed through massive industrial windows, illuminating open-concept workstations where young, brilliant architects collaborated. It was a space that breathed life and innovation, the antithesis of the cold, corporate monolith of Blackwood Tower. At the heart of it all was Isabel Rossi. 5 years had transformed her. The soft, romantic girl was gone, replaced by a woman of breathtaking elegance and steely composure. Her dark hair was cut in a sharp professional bob, and her designer suits were a form of armor. There was a cool, watchful intelligence in her eyes that could intimidate seasoned executives and charm skeptical clients in equal measure. The only softness that remained was reserved for one person, her son. "Mommy, look." Isabel looked up from the complex blueprints spread across her glass desk. Rowan, now a bright, energetic 5-year-old, stood proudly beside a tower of building blocks that was nearly as tall as he was. He had her expressive eyes, but the determined set of his jaw and the unruly wave in his dark hair were pure Damien. A pang, sharp and familiar, went through her heart. It was a pain she had learned to live with, a ghost that haunted the features of the person she loved most in the world. She smiled, the ice in her professional demeanor melting away instantly. "That's the most amazing tower I have ever seen, my little architect. Is it earthquake-proof?" Rowan giggled, a sound that was music to her ears. "It's super-duper quake-proof," he declared, before promptly knocking the whole thing down with a gleeful roar. Her assistant, a sharp young woman named Clara, poked her head in. "Rossi, the board from the consortium, is on the video call." Isabel scooped Rowan into a hug, kissing his cheek. "Okay, Bug. Time to go with Clara. We'll build a whole city when I get home tonight." "A city with a chocolate river?" he asked, his eyes wide. "A city with 2 chocolate rivers," she promised, handing him over. As soon as the door closed, her warm maternal expression vanished, replaced by the focused, formidable mask of her CEO persona. She straightened her blazer and sat down facing the large screen on her wall. A dozen faces, the leaders of a global investment group, stared back at her. "Good morning, gentlemen," she said, her voice crisp and confident. For the next hour, she masterfully navigated the final pitch for their firm to design a new state-of-the-art biomedical campus in Singapore. She answered complex engineering questions with ease, detailed budget projections with unassailable logic, and painted a vision of a facility that was not just functional, but inspirational. By the time the call ended, she knew she had sealed the deal. It was another victory, another testament to how far she had come. Finch Rossi Designs was no longer a small Chicago-based firm. Isabel had expanded aggressively, opening a highly successful European headquarters in London. She had become a force in the industry, a disruptor, known for designs that were both environmentally revolutionary and breathtakingly beautiful. She was rich, respected, and powerful in her own right. She had built a fortress around herself and her son, a life so far removed from the rubble of her past that she sometimes allowed herself to believe she was truly safe. Later that week, a formal invitation arrived. It was printed on heavy cream-colored cardstock, the kind of ostentatious display she now despised. The city of New York was officially announcing the most ambitious urban development project of the century, the Olympus Project. It was a multi-billion-dollar contract to revitalize a huge swathe of the city's derelict industrial waterfront, turning it into a futuristic hub of technology, residential living, and green space. It was a legacy project, the kind of commission that would define a generation of architecture. Every major firm in the world would be vying for it. Her initial instinct was to throw the invitation away. New York was a graveyard of memories she had no desire to visit. She had built her new world an ocean away for a reason. But as she read the project brief, the architect in her stirred. The sheer scale, the challenge, the opportunity to reshape a piece of the city that had so cruelly rejected her, it was an irresistible song. This wasn't just another contract. This was the ultimate validation. To win this, to put her name on the New York skyline, would be the final definitive proof that she had not just survived, she had conquered. Clara entered her office holding a tablet. The preliminary bidders list for the Olympus project is being circulated online. Ms. Rossi, it's quite the lineup. Isabel took the tablet, her eyes scanning the names of the world's most elite architectural and development firms. Sterling Corp, the Otani Group, And then, at the top of the list, a name that made the air in her lungs turn to ice: Blackwood Holdings. Of course, it was Damien's home turf. A project of this magnitude in New York would inevitably have his name all over it. He wouldn't just be a bidder. His firm's political and financial influence in the city made him a frontrunner. To compete for this project meant walking directly back into the lion's den. It meant facing him. She stared at the name, the clean corporate font, doing nothing to soften the jagged edges of her memory. For 5 years, she had meticulously built her empire, brick by painful brick. She had become a queen in her own right, ruling from a kingdom of her own making. Was she strong enough to return to the city where she had been a pawn? A wave of cold fury washed over her, extinguishing the flicker of fear. Why was she even hesitating? Fear was a luxury she had shed long ago, along with her tears and her trust. She wasn't that girl anymore. She was Ms. Rossi, and Ms. Rossi did not run from a challenge. She ran towards it. This was more than a project. It was a reckoning, a chance to meet him, not as a heartbroken victim, but as an equal, a rival, a chance to show him the woman he had thrown away, to see the flicker of recognition in his eyes, and let him know that he had created a power he could never have imagined. She would not just compete, she would win. She would take the crown jewel of his city from right under his nose, and she would do it without ever letting him see the scars he had left on her soul. "Clara," she said, her voice calm and dangerously steady, "book me a flight to New York and assemble the Olympus team. We have a proposal to write." "Yes, Ms. Rossi," Clara replied, a little surprised by the sudden fierce intensity in her boss's eyes. As Clara left, Isabel's gaze fell on a small framed photo on her desk. It was of her and Rowan in a park, both of them laughing, their heads thrown back in joy. This was what she was fighting for. Her son, her future, her legacy. Damien Blackwood had taken everything from her once. This time, she would be the one to do the taking. The phoenix was not just rising, she was returning to the fire, ready to claim the ashes as her own. The boardroom on the 50th floor of New York's municipal building was a theater of power. Sunlight streamed through floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the very waterfront. The Olympus project was destined to transform. The air was thick with the scent of expensive suits and quiet, cutthroat ambition. At the head of the long mahogany table sat Damien Blackwood. 5 years had honed him, chiseling away any remaining softness. He was leaner, his dark hair lightly dusted with silver at the temples, which only served to make him look more distinguished, more formidable. His eyes, however, were the same, the color of a storm-tossed sea, missing nothing, conceding nothing. He commanded the room with an effortless authority, the undisputed king in his domain. His firm, Blackwood Holdings, was the lead developer in the consortium favored to win the project. This meeting, a preliminary presentation from the finalist architectural firms, was largely considered a formality. He was reviewing the final attendance list when a name caught his eye: Finch Rossi Designs. He recognized the name Finch Old Arthur, the sanctimonious relic who had always despised his family's work. But the other name, Rossi, meant nothing to him. He dismissed it. They were a London-based firm, a dark horse. Talented, according to his research team, but no match for the political and financial might of Blackwood Holdings. The doors opened and the representatives from Finch Rossi Designs entered. First came a team of 3 sharp-looking junior architects carrying presentation materials, and then she walked in. The entire room seemed to hold its breath. The woman who entered was a vision of cool, controlled power. She wore a tailored navy blue suit that was both feminine and severe. Her posture was perfect, her every movement economical and precise. Her face was a masterpiece of striking angles and confident composure. For a split second, a jolt of something primal and familiar shot through Damien. A ghost of a memory, a scent, the curve of a cheekbone. But he dismissed it instantly. This woman was a stranger, a beautiful, intimidating stranger. She took her seat directly opposite him at the table, her team flanking her. She placed a sleek, minimalist portfolio in front of her and met his gaze across the polished wood. Her eyes were dark, intelligent, and utterly unreadable. "Good morning," she said, her voice cool and clear, with a faint, transatlantic accent she had acquired over her years in London. "I am Isabel Rossi, CEO and lead architect of Finch Rossi Designs." The name Isabel Rossi hit Damien like a physical blow. The air left his lungs. It couldn't be. The girl he had known was soft, gentle, full of romantic notions and easy tears. This woman was forged from ice and steel. He stared, searching her face for the girl he had destroyed. He found her in the elegant curve of her lips, the subtle arch of her brow, the deep, soulful brown of her eyes that now looked at him as if he were a complete stranger, a minor obstacle in her path. The shock was so profound, he was momentarily speechless. One of the city planners cleared his throat. "Mr. Blackwood, shall we begin with Ms. Rossi's presentation?" Damien blinked, forcing the mask of impenetrable calm back onto his face. Of course, he managed his voice a little rougher than usual. "Ms. Rossi, the floor is yours." Isabel stood, and for the next 30 minutes, she held the entire room captive. She didn't just present a design, she presented a new philosophy for urban living. Her vision for the Olympus project was audacious and brilliant. She spoke of kinetic energy grids, vertical farms integrated into residential towers, public spaces designed to foster community, and a revolutionary water reclamation system that would make the development almost entirely self-sufficient. She moved with a confidence that bordered on arrogance, yet her arguments were so logical, so innovative, so deeply compelling that no one could look away. She never once faltered under Damien's intense, burning gaze. She addressed her presentation to the City Planning Committee, her tone professional, her focus absolute. It was a masterful performance of indifference, and it drove a stake deep into Damien's pride. When she finished, there was a moment of stunned silence before the room broke into spontaneous, enthusiastic applause. She had not just met expectations, she had shattered them. She had transformed from a dark horse into a genuine contender. "An impressive vision, Ms. Rossi," one of the committee members said. "Though the cost projections seem ambitious." "They are," Isabel agreed smoothly without missing a beat. "But our models show the long-term savings in energy and water consumption will offset the initial investment within 12 years, providing the city with a net gain for the remainder of the century. It is not just an investment in infrastructure, it is an investment in the future." Damien finally found his voice. He couldn't let her dominate. He had to find a flaw, a weakness. "Your central residential tower," he began, his tone sharp and critical. "Its design is unconventional. The load-bearing structure appears to rely on a complex cantilever system that could be a significant engineering risk." Isabel turned her cool gaze on him. There was no flicker of recognition, no hint of their shared, catastrophic past. It was as if she were addressing any other competitor. "The cantilever system is based on bridge construction principles, Mr. Blackwood," she replied, her voice tinged with academic condescension. "It has been stress-tested in our simulations to withstand forces well beyond any known seismic or weather-related event in this region. Perhaps if your engineers were more familiar with modern material science, they would recognize the ingenuity of the design rather than perceive it as a risk." The subtle professional insult hung in the air. She had not only defended her design, she had publicly questioned the competence of his entire team. A murmur went through the room. Damien felt a surge of unfamiliar emotions, rage, humiliation, and a grudging, infuriating sense of admiration. This was not the woman he had cast out. This was his equal. The meeting concluded, and the committee declared that both Finch Rossi and Blackwood Holdings would move to the final stage, requiring them to collaborate on a joint feasibility study. They would be forced to work together. As people began to file out, Damien moved directly into her path. He had to hear it from her. He had to break through that impenetrable facade. "Isabel," he said, his voice low. She paused, turning to face him. Up close, he could see the faint lines of exhaustion around her eyes, the only sign that she was human. But her expression remained a mask of polite detachment. "Mr. Blackwood," she corrected him coolly. "It is you," he breathed, the reality of it still staggering. "After all these years." "I'm not sure what you mean," she said, her voice as smooth as glass. "I believe this is our first professional encounter. Now, if you'll excuse me, my team is waiting." She made to step around him, but he blocked her way again. "Don't play games with me. 5 years ago." A flicker of something cold and dangerous lit her eyes. 5 years ago, a young, foolish girl with my name learned a valuable lesson about the nature of power and the loyalties of men like you. That girl is long gone. You are speaking to Miss Rossi, CEO of Finch Rossi Designs, and I would advise you to remember that during our upcoming collaboration. Keep it professional. I certainly will. She sidestepped him and walked away, her heels clicking with sharp finality on the marble floor, leaving Damien standing alone, reeling. The ghost he thought he had buried had returned not as a haunting memory, but as a living, breathing rival, more brilliant and more formidable than he could ever have imagined. And as he watched her go, a terrifying, unwelcome seed of doubt began to sprout in the barren ground of his certainty. If he had been so wrong about her potential, her strength, her resilience, what else had he been wrong about? The forced collaboration was a form of exquisite torture for Damien. He and Isabel worked in a tense professional silence, but her cool brilliance and unwavering competence made the old accusations seem utterly absurd. This powerful, self-made woman was no corporate spy, haunted by the person she had become. The seed of doubt that had been planted within him grew into a consuming obsession. He had to know the truth. He hired a private cybersecurity team with a single directive: trace the $50,000 deposit from 5 years ago back to its absolute source. While the investigation was underway, Damien's carefully constructed world was shattered by a chance encounter. Walking aimlessly after a grueling meeting, he found himself near a park. There, he saw Isabel on a bench, but she was transformed. The icy CEO was gone, replaced by a mother whose face was soft with adoration as she watched a little boy with dark, unruly hair. When the child stumbled and looked up, Damien's world stopped turning. The boy had his eyes. It was an undeniable, soul-shattering recognition. This was his son, a living, breathing child he had ordered to be erased. His monstrous words, "Get rid of it," crashed down on him with the force of a physical blow. The sheer scale of his cruelty, of his loss, left him breathless. He stumbled back into the shadows, a ghost at the edge of his own family's life. Reeling from the discovery, Damien returned to his office to find the proof that would seal his self-damnation. The cybersecurity report was on his desk. The money hadn't come from a corporate rival. It had been meticulously routed through a dozen shell companies originating from a dormant trust fund controlled by Chloe Vanderbilt. The final piece of the puzzle was delivered moments later by his trusted executive assistant. She nervously reported that a senior architect, Mark Renshaw, had gotten drunk at a company function the night before. He had boasted that he owed his entire career to Chloe Vanderbilt, who had helped him get rid of a problem 5 years ago, laughing about how blind Damien had been. The truth was a venomous cascade. He had been a puppet masterfully played by Chloe's jealousy and his own arrogant pride. A cold fury propelled him from his office. He found Chloe at a charity luncheon, the picture of social grace. He pulled her out to a terrace, his face a thunderous mask. The money, the photos. "Mark Renshaw," he growled. "It was all you." The color drained from her face. I don't know what you're talking about." "Don't lie to me," he roared, his control snapping. "You destroyed her. You framed an innocent woman and made me throw away my own child. I did it for you, Chloe shrieked, her facade crumbling. She was a nobody. I did what needed to be done. You did it for yourself, Damien snarled, his voice dropping to a deadly calm. And now it's over. Every contract between Blackwood Holdings and your family is terminated. I will dismantle your life with the same precision you used on hers. He left her to her ruin, but felt no victory. There was only a hollow, profound ache. Avenging Isabel wasn't enough. He had to find her. He had to confess his sins and beg for a chance, not for himself, but for the little boy with his eyes. A storm broke over New York, the sky weeping as Damien waited across the street from Isabel's office. He was soaked. His expensive suit ruined his usual authority, washed away with the grime of the city. When Isabel finally emerged, a trench coat pulled tight against the wind, he crossed the street, a man stripped of all pretense. "Isabel," he called out over the roar of the rain. She turned, her body tensing. "Mr. Blackwood," she said, her voice sharp. "If this is about the project, it can wait." "It's not about the project," he said, stopping a few feet from her. "It's about 5 years ago. It was Chloe." He told her everything in a desperate, ragged rush, the doctored photos. The money from Chloe's trust fund, the confession he'd wrung from Mark Renshaw. He explained how he had already dismantled Chloe's life, but that it brought him no satisfaction. Isabel's face was a stone mask against the storm. "And you expect me to believe this now after 5 years? It doesn't matter if you believe me," he said, his voice breaking. "What matters is what I did to you, what I didn't know until I saw him." Her breath hitched. "I saw our son, Isabel, in the park. He has my eyes." The shame became a physical weight too heavy to bear. The ruthless CEO, the King of New York, fell to his knees on the wet pavement. "I am not asking for your forgiveness." He wept, tears and rain becoming one on his face. "I don't deserve it. I threw away everything. But he, Rowan, he is innocent. He deserves a father. Please, just let me earn the right to be that man." Isabel looked down at the broken man who had shattered her world. She had dreamed of this moment, but there was no triumph in it, only a profound, hollow sorrow. "Get up, Damien," she commanded, her voice trembling but firm. "You look pathetic." He struggled to his feet, dripping water and shame awaiting her judgment. "You're right," she said, her eyes boring into his. "You don't deserve forgiveness. The girl you destroyed is gone forever, and the woman who took her place will never trust you." He flinched, but accepted the truth of her words. "But Rowan deserves a father," she continued, her voice softening almost imperceptibly. "You will earn him. No gifts, no shortcuts. You will show up, for scraped knees and bedtime stories. You will be present." A flicker of desperate hope ignited in his eyes. "And Damien," she said, stepping closer, her voice a deadly whisper, "if you ever for 1 second hurt him, if you ever break his heart the way you broke mine, I will be the one who destroys you." With that, she turned and walked away, leaving him standing alone in the rain. It was not a reconciliation. It was not forgiveness. But it was a beginning, a fragile, terrifying chance at atonement. And so our story doesn't end with a fairy tale kiss in the rain, but with the fragile promise of a new beginning, born from the wreckage of a devastating betrayal. Isabel Rossi, a woman who rebuilt herself from nothing, now holds all the power. She has the career, the son, and the strength to dictate the terms of her own future. Damien Blackwood, the ruthless CEO, has finally learned the painful lesson that true power isn't about controlling an empire, but about the courage to admit when you are wrong and the humility to fight for what you've lost. Their journey is far from over. Can a love so brutally broken ever truly be mended? Can a man who committed the ultimate betrayal ever truly earn the title of father? What do you think Isabel should do? Let us know in the comments below. If this story of heartbreak, resilience, and hard-won redemption moved you, please give this video a thumbs up. Share it with someone who loves a powerful comeback story. And don't forget to subscribe to our channel for more tales that will keep you on the edge of your seat. Thank you for listening.
A single piece of paper should have been her vindication. For a pregnant Alice Hayes, the DNA test clutched in her trembling hand was the absolute truth, the legal key to securing her unborn child's future. But when she presented it in the hallowed halls of a Charleston family court, the only response she received was laughter. It was cold, cruel, and confident laughter from her husband's mistress, the immaculate Victoria Vance. The judge looked on a flicker of pity in his eyes as a second test confirmed the impossible David Hayes, Alice's husband of 10 years, was not the father. Her world didn't just crack, it imploded. But what if the science itself was telling a lie? What if the deepest, most shocking betrayals are written not in our hearts, but in our very blood? The late afternoon sun, thick and golden, as honey streamed through the Palladian windows of the Hayes residence in Charleston's historic South of Broad neighborhood. It illuminated the dust motes dancing in the air, each one a tiny, glittering secret. For Alice Hayes, this light had once been a symbol of warmth and clarity. Now it felt accusatory, exposing the fine cracks in the porcelain veneer of her life. At 38, she was 7 months pregnant with the child she and her husband David had yearned for, a small miracle after years of quiet heartache and sterile clinics. The nursery was painted a soft, hopeful shade of seafoam green. A handcrafted wooden mobile of celestial bodies bought on their last anniversary trip to Asheville hung over the crib, waiting for tiny eyes to gaze up at it. Everything was perfect. Except it was all a lie. David Hayes was a man sculpted from ambition and old Charleston money. He was a partner at a private equity firm, a world of crisp suits, hushed phone calls, and numbers that could alter the fates of companies. He moved with an easy confidence that Alice had once found intoxicating. He'd courted her with the same strategic precision he applied to a hostile takeover. Flowers every Tuesday, surprise weekend, getaways, whispered promises of a future as solid and grand as the antebellum homes surrounding them. She, a talented art historian who had put her career on hold, had believed him. She had built her entire world within the beautiful gilded cage of their marriage. The first crack appeared not as a dramatic fissure, but as a hairline fracture, almost invisible to the naked eye. It was the scent of a perfume that wasn't hers clinging to his suit jacket, a heady, expensive scent of tuberose and sandalwood. When she'd asked, he'd laughed it off. Victoria's, probably. We were crammed into a taxi after the merger dinner. The woman marinates in it. Victoria Vance. Her name, spoken so casually, landed like a stone in a tranquil pond. Victoria was David's newest partner at the firm, a fiercely intelligent woman with a razor-sharp wit and a wardrobe to match. Alice had met her a few times at corporate events. She was all sharp angles and predatory smiles, the kind of woman who didn't walk into a room so much as conquer it. Then came the late nights blamed on market volatility in Asia. The weekend trips for emergency meetings that left him looking exhausted but strangely energized. The way he angled his phone away from her, the screen going dark the moment she entered the room. Alice was not a fool, but she was a master of self-deception, an expert at papering over the cracks to preserve the beautiful facade. The baby, this precious, long-awaited child, was supposed to be the mortar that sealed their foundation forever. The illusion finally shattered on a rainy Tuesday. David had claimed to be in a late-night negotiation. Alice, unable to sleep, the baby kicking restlessly beneath her ribs, had driven to his office building downtown. His car, a sleek black Mercedes, was not in its designated spot in the parking garage. A cold dread, slick and oily, coated her throat. On a desperate whim, she drove past the Spectator, a chic, dimly lit hotel bar he and his colleagues sometimes frequented. And there it was, his car parked right outside. She didn't go in. She didn't need to. She sat in her own car across the street, the rain blurring the world outside her heart, hammering a frantic, painful rhythm against her ribs. An hour later, they emerged. David and Victoria. They weren't talking business. His hand was resting possessively on the small of her back. As they paused under the hotel's awning, Victoria reached up, straightened his tie with an air of practiced intimacy, and then rose on her toes to kiss him. It wasn't a fleeting, friendly peck. It was a slow, deliberate kiss, a claim. David's hands came up to cup her face, pulling her closer. Alice felt the air leave her lungs in a silent scream. The world tilted the streetlights, smearing into abstract streaks of pain. She drove home in a daze, the sound of the windshield wipers mimicking the frantic, repetitive thought in her head, "It's real. It's real. It's real." When David came home hours later, smelling of rain and that same tuberose perfume, she was waiting for him in the grand foyer, the single lamp, casting long, distorted shadows. "Alice, what are you doing up so late?" he asked, his voice a practiced melody of concern. "The Spectator," she said, her own voice sounding foreign, brittle. "How was the emergency meeting?" The practiced smile on his face faltered. For a split second, she saw him for what he was, a cornered animal calculating his escape. "It was a long night. We grabbed a final drink to celebrate." "You kissed her, David." The words were quiet, but they held the weight of a death sentence. "You stood under the awning, and you kissed her, like you used to kiss me." The gaslighting came next, a torrent of denials and accusations. She was being hormonal, overly emotional. Her pregnancy was making her paranoid. He was under immense pressure at work, and this was how she supported him. He was a master manipulator, twisting her own reality until she almost doubted the evidence of her own eyes. But the image was seared into her brain, a permanent scar on her memory. The fight escalated, the whispers turning to shouts that echoed through the perfect, silent house. It ended with David's cold, final declaration. "This marriage is over, Alice," he said, his face a mask of detached cruelty. "It has been for a long time." He paused, delivering the final devastating blow. "And don't for a second think you're getting a free ride. That baby you're carrying. We both know the struggles we had. I want a paternity test. I'm not paying a cent in child support until I see definitive proof." The demand was so audacious, so profoundly cruel, that it shocked her into silence. After years of shared tears in fertility clinics, of holding her hand through invasive procedures, of celebrating the positive test with what she thought were genuine tears of joy, he was now using their most private pain as a weapon against her. He was not just leaving her. He was trying to erase her, to invalidate her motherhood, to sever the very biological bond that tied them together. In that moment, something inside Alice hardened. The grief was still there, a vast black ocean threatening to drown her. But beneath it, a new unyielding bedrock of resolve was forming. He wanted proof. He wanted a fight. He would get one. She would not be erased. She would walk into that courtroom with her head held high, armed with the undeniable truth of science. She would prove he was the father not for his sake, but for her child's. She would secure their future, and she would make David Hayes face the one thing he could not manipulate or deny, the simple biological truth. Or so she thought. The days that followed were a blur of cold reality. David moved out his departure as swift and efficient as a business transaction. He left behind a house that suddenly felt cavernous and hostile, every object a ghost of a shared memory. His lawyer, a piranha in a $1,000 suit named Robert Thorne, sent the first volley a divorce petition that was as brutal as it was insulting. It painted Alice as an unstable, gold-digging spouse and formally demanded a court-adjudicated DNA test to establish paternity before any discussion of child support or alimony. Alice's sister Sarah flew in from Atlanta, her presence a warm, steadying anchor in the maelstrom. It was Sarah who found Ms. Diana Finch, a family law attorney whose reputation was built on a combination of sharp legal acumen and fierce compassion. Ms. Finch's office, located in a restored historic building, was the antithesis of Robert Thorne's chrome and glass tower. It was filled with books, warm wood, and the faint scent of Earl Grey tea, a sanctuary of calm competence. "He's trying to build a narrative, Alice," Ms. Finch explained during their first meeting, her voice calm and measured as she reviewed the petition. "He wants to paint you as deceitful, to minimize his own culpability, and more importantly, his financial liability. The paternity demand is a classic ugly tactic. It's designed to humiliate you and cast doubt on your character from the outset." Alice sat stiffly, her hands protectively cradling her swollen belly. "But we went through 3 rounds of IVF, Diana. He was there. He held my hand. He signed the consent forms. It's his child. There is no question." "I believe you," Ms. Finch said, her eyes meeting Alice's with unwavering sincerity. "And we have the records from the fertility clinic, which will be crucial. But Mr. Thorne is going to argue that those records don't preclude the possibility of infidelity. It's despicable, but it's the game he'll play. So we will play our own game. We'll beat them at it." The strategy was simple: get ahead of their demand. Ms. Finch recommended a non-invasive prenatal paternity test, NIPT. It was a cutting-edge procedure that could determine paternity with over 99% accuracy as early as 7 weeks into pregnancy by analyzing the fetal DNA fragments circulating in the mother's bloodstream and comparing them to a DNA sample from the potential father. "We do our own test with a reputable certified lab," Ms. Finch advised. "We get the results and we walk into that preliminary hearing with irrefutable proof. It will shut down Mr. Thorne's entire strategy before he even gets a chance to deploy it. It cuts the legs out from under his argument and shows the court that his demand is nothing more than a malicious tactic to harass a pregnant woman." The logistics were cold and clinical. A kit was sent to their respective locations. Alice went to a sterile lab, a kind nurse drawing vials of her blood. David, according to his lawyer, provided a cheek swab sample at a facility across town. The process felt deeply violating, reducing the miracle of her pregnancy to a chain of custody and a bar-coded specimen bag. Every step was a fresh reminder of David's betrayal. He wasn't just denying their history. He was attempting to scientifically sever his connection to their future. While they waited for the results, the legal battle intensified. Thorne sent discovery requests demanding years of Alice's personal financial records diaries and even correspondences with friends searching for any hint of indiscretion. He filed motions to limit her access to their joint accounts, effectively trying to starve her out. It was a war of attrition, and David, with his vast resources and Victoria's strategic mind whispering in his ear, was fighting to win at any cost. Alice spent her days surrounded by stacks of legal documents, the fine print blurring into a meaningless jumble. The seafoam green nursery, once a source of joy, now felt like a room in a stranger's house. She would sit in the rocking chair, her hand on her belly, feeling the baby move, and whisper promises to him. "I'm fighting for you," she would say, her voice thick with emotion. "No matter what he says, no matter what he does, you are wanted, and you are loved." and you are your father's son." One evening, Sarah found her weeping silently in the nursery. "This is what he wants, Alice," Sarah said, kneeling beside her and taking her hand. "He wants you to break. He and that viper Victoria are banking on you being too exhausted and too heartbroken to fight back. You can't let them win." "How can he do this?" Alice whispered the question she'd asked herself 1,000 times. "How can he look at everything we built, everything we went through to have this baby, and just try to burn it all to the ground?" "Because he's weak," Sarah said, her voice firm. "And he's being controlled by a woman who sees you and this baby as a threat to her position and his wallet. This isn't about love anymore, Alice. It's a business deal. You are a liability they are trying to mitigate." Sarah's words were harsh, but they were true. Stripped of emotion, this was a strategic battle. Understanding that gave Alice a strange sense of clarity. She wasn't just a scorned wife. She was an opponent. And she would not be underestimated. A week later, a crisp, sealed envelope arrived via courier at Ms. Finch's office. The results were in. Alice's hands trembled as Diana opened it, her own heart pounding in her ears. She knew logically what it would say. But David's campaign of psychological warfare had been so effective that a sliver of doubt, a poisonous seed, had been planted in her mind. Ms. Finch unfolded the single sheet of paper, her eyes scanning the technical jargon. A slow, relieved smile spread across her face. She turned the paper around for Alice to see. There, in bold, unambiguous print, was the conclusion: probability of paternity, 99.999%. The relief was so immense, so overwhelming that it felt like a physical weight lifting from her chest. Tears streamed down her face, but for the first time in weeks, they were tears not of sorrow, but of vindication. It was here. The truth printed in black and white, her weapon, her shield. "This is it," Ms. Finch said, her voice filled with quiet triumph. "This is the ball game. We'll file this with the court tomorrow. Thorne and his client won't know what hit them." Alice clutched the report to her chest, the paper crinkling in her hand. It felt like the most precious document in the world. She finally had her proof. The legal gauntlet had been grueling, but she had navigated it. Now, all that was left was to present the undeniable truth in court and watch David's web of lies fall to pieces. She pictured his face, Victoria's face, when the judge read the result. She would finally have her justice. The thought gave her a strength she hadn't felt in months. She was ready. The Charleston County Family Court was an imposing building of marble and mahogany designed to convey a sense of gravitas and unassailable authority. To Alice, it felt like a coliseum, and she was a gladiator about to face the lions. She walked through the heavy double doors with Ms. Finch by her side, her back straight, her hand resting on the gentle curve of her belly. The DNA test result was nestled in a crisp file folder in her lawyer's briefcase, a talisman against the impending storm. David and his lawyer, Robert Thorne, were already seated at the opposing table. David looked impeccable in a navy suit, his face a mask of detached indifference. He refused to meet her gaze, focusing instead on some distant point on the wall behind her. But it was Victoria Vance who truly took Alice's breath away. She wasn't seated in the gallery where a casual observer might sit. She was at the table right next to David, a stack of papers in front of her, as if she were part of his legal team. She wore a severe blood-red dress that stood in stark contrast to the courtroom's somber tones. She looked at Alice, and a slow, smug smile spread across her lips. It was a look of utter confidence, of someone who knew the outcome of a game before it had even begun. The sight of her so brazen and triumphant sent a hot spike of anger through Alice's veins, momentarily eclipsing her fear. This woman had not only stolen her husband, but was now attempting to orchestrate the demolition of her life in a public forum. "Her presence here is highly irregular," Ms. Finch whispered to Alice. Her eyes narrowed. "It's pure intimidation. Ignore her. Focus on the judge." Judge Harrison entered a stern, gray-haired man whose expression suggested he had seen every form of human misery and was impressed by none of it. The proceedings began with a dry recitation of case numbers and legal formalities. Mr. Thorne spoke first, his voice smooth and commanding. "Your Honor, we are here today on a simple matter of due diligence. My client, Mr. Hayes, has reason to question the paternity of the child being carried by Mrs. Hayes. Before any further discussions regarding marital assets or support, we contend that this fundamental issue must be resolved. We have therefore filed a motion to compel a court-ordered paternity test." Ms. Finch rose gracefully. "Your Honor, we find this motion to be not only unnecessary, but also a clear act of malicious litigation intended to cause distress to my client during a vulnerable time. Mr. Hayes's sudden doubts are a transparent attempt to shirk his responsibilities." She paused for effect, letting her words hang in the silent room. "However, in the interest of resolving this matter swiftly and putting an end to Mr. Hayes's baseless accusations, we have already taken the liberty of securing a DNA test." She walked to the clerk and submitted the report from the certified lab. "This is the result of a non-invasive prenatal paternity test, Your Honor, conducted by GenTrack Diagnostics, a leader in the field. It was performed last month with samples provided by both my client and Mr. Hayes. The chain of custody was impeccable." Judge Harrison took the document, his eyes scanning the page. Alice held her breath, her gaze fixed on David. His mask of indifference finally slipped. A flicker of something confusion, anxiety crossed his face. He glanced at Victoria, who gave him a subtle, reassuring shake of her head. Her smile never wavered. "The report states," Judge Harrison said, his voice booming in the quiet room, "a 99.999% probability of paternity. It seems quite conclusive, Mr. Thorne." "With all due respect, Your Honor," Thorne boomed, stepping forward, "we strongly object to the admission of this privately commissioned document. We have no way of verifying the integrity of the sample provided by Mrs. Hayes or the lab's procedures. It is for this very reason that court-ordered testing is the standard. In fact, Your Honor, we were so certain of the need for an impartial test that we commissioned one ourselves through a court-approved facility using the same samples provided for the test Mrs. Hayes has presented." A cold knot of dread formed in Alice's stomach. This was an ambush. Thorne produced his own sealed envelope with a theatrical flourish. "We received the results this morning, Your Honor, and they tell a very, very different story." He handed the report to the judge. Alice watched as Judge Harrison's eyebrows furrowed. He read the document, then reread it, his expression shifting from mild impatience to genuine surprise. He looked from the paper to Alice, a hint of pity in his eyes. "Mr. Thorne," the judge said slowly, "this report from the Charleston Forensics Laboratory states that the probability of your client, David Hayes, being the biological father is 0%. The words hit Alice like a physical blow. "What?" The sound escaped her lips as a strangled gasp. "No, that's impossible. That's a lie." And then it happened. Victoria Vance laughed. It wasn't a small chuckle. It was a full, unrestrained laugh, rich with derision and triumph. The sound echoed in the silent wood-paneled courtroom. It was the most soul-crushing sound Alice had ever heard. It was the sound of her own humiliation, her deepest truth being publicly mocked. Every head in the courtroom turned to stare at her. She felt her face burn with shame. In that moment, she was exactly what David and Victoria wanted her to be, a hysterical, deceitful woman caught in a lie. Ms. Finch was on her feet instantly. "Your Honor, this is outrageous. This is a fabrication. There must be a mistake, a tampered sample, a clerical error." "A mistake, Ms. Finch," Thorne interjected smoothly. "Or an admission of the truth that my client has suspected all along. It seems Mrs. Hayes is the one who has been fabricating things." David remained silent, but he finally looked at Alice. There was no sympathy in his eyes, only a cold, hard judgment. It was the look of a man who had successfully framed an innocent person for a crime. Alice's mind raced, trying to make sense of the impossible. A mistake. A switched sample. Could David have paid someone off? How could two tests on the same samples produce polar opposite results? The world felt unreal, a dizzying nightmare from which she couldn't wake. Her truth, the one thing she had clung to, had been stolen and twisted into a lie. Judge Harrison banged his gavel. "Order, I will have order." He looked at the two conflicting reports in his hands, then at Alice's stricken face and Victoria's triumphant smirk. "We have two certified lab reports with diametrically opposed conclusions. This is a highly unusual situation." He looked down at Alice, and his voice softened almost imperceptibly. "Mrs. Hayes, the evidence presented by the petitioner is compelling. While I note the discrepancy, the burden of proof is on you." He sighed, a man clearly frustrated by the morning's drama. "Given the contradictory nature of these documents, the court has no choice but to order a second test, a new one. Samples from both parties will be collected here today by a court-appointed phlebotomist. They will be sealed in my presence and sent to a neutral, out-of-state facility for analysis. We will reconvene when those results are available." For David and Victoria, this was a victory. They had successfully muddied the waters, transforming Alice's undeniable truth into a he said, she said circus. As the judge adjourned the hearing, Victoria leaned over and whispered something in David's ear, and he finally smiled. Alice felt a hand on her arm. It was Ms. Finch, her face grim but resolute. "Alice, breathe. This is not over. I don't know what trick they just pulled, but we are going to find out. Do you hear me? This is not over." But as Alice walked out of the courtroom, the sound of Victoria's laughter still ringing in her ears, she felt like it was. She had walked in with the truth, and now she was leaving in disgrace, her credibility shattered, publicly branded as a liar and an adulteress. The whole world thought she was a fraud, and the one person who knew the truth was the man who had orchestrated her downfall. The weeks following the court hearing were the darkest of Alice's life. The public humiliation was a heavy cloak she couldn't shed. Whispers seemed to follow her everywhere, from the grocery store to her own quiet street. She felt the pitying glances, the judgmental stares. David's narrative had taken root. She was the spurned wife, trying to trap a wealthy man with a child that wasn't his. Robert Thorne had leaked details of the conflicting DNA tests to the local society columns, framing the story with a sympathetic bent toward David, the powerful man betrayed. Alice retreated into the sanctuary of her home, but even there, the silence was suffocating. Every ticking clock seemed to be counting down to her final, official ruin. She felt a profound sense of despair, a bone-deep weariness that made even the simplest tasks feel monumental. The second DNA test, the tiebreaker, felt less like an opportunity and more like a formality before her sentence was read. What if it too came back negative? What kind of sorcery were David and Victoria capable of? The doubt they had so expertly planted began to sprout toxic weeds in her mind. Ms. Finch was her only lifeline. The shrewd attorney was utterly convinced of foul play. "Judges hate this kind of circus, Alice," she said during one of their many calls. "But they are bound by evidence. Right now it's a battle of the labs. We need more than just your word. We need to find a flaw in their evidence. A crack. Something." Diana Finch was methodical. She subpoenaed every piece of paper associated with both DNA tests, lab intake forms, chain of custody documents, analyst notes, machine calibration records. For days, she and a paralegal pored over the hundreds of pages of technical data, a sea of jargon and numbers. Alice sat with them trying to help, but her mind was a fog of grief and anxiety. The breakthrough when it came was not a dramatic smoking gun. It was a tiny, almost insignificant detail buried deep within the paperwork from the fertility clinic documents they had acquired to prove David's participation in the IVF process. "That's odd," Ms. Finch murmured late one evening, her reading glasses perched on the end of her nose. She was staring at an intake form from 2 years prior from their very first IVF consultation. "What is it?" Alice asked, her voice listless. "It's David's family medical history form. He filled it out himself." She pointed to a section. "Blood type. He listed himself as O negative." "Yes, that's right," Alice confirmed. "He always said he was the universal donor. It was a point of pride for him." "Right," Diana said, her fingers drumming on the table. "But look at this." She slid one of the reports from the court-approved Lab Thorne's lab across the table. It was a detailed genetic marker analysis. This lab, as part of their standard process, also determined his blood type from the DNA sample. According to this, the sample he provided is from a person with AB-positive blood. Alice stared at the two conflicting pieces of information. O negative, AB positive. They were not just different, they were genetically incompatible. A person couldn't be both. "He must have filled out the form wrong," Alice said, though the excuse sounded weak even to her own ears. "A man as meticulous as your husband," Ms. Finch countered, her eyes gleaming with a renewed intensity. "A man who prides himself on being a universal donor. It's possible, but it's sloppy. And David Hayes is not sloppy." She leaned back in her chair, a thoughtful expression on her face. What if the sample he submitted to Thorne's lab wasn't his? The implication hung in the air. Had he gotten someone else to submit a DNA sample for him, it was a possibility. It would be a bold criminal act of fraud upon the court. But the first test? Alice argued, her mind struggling to keep up. The one we ordered. It came back positive. He submitted a sample for that one, too. Why would he give a real sample to us and a fake one to his own lawyer's lab? Maybe he didn't know which lab was which, Ms. Finch mused. Maybe he thought our test was the court-ordered one and panicked. It doesn't quite add up. It's a contradiction. For the next few days, Ms. Finch was consumed by this discrepancy. The blood type anomaly was a loose thread, and she was determined to pull it until the entire tapestry of David's deception unraveled. She made a call to a trusted contact, a former medical examiner turned private investigator, and tasked him with a discreet but deep dive into David Hayes's entire medical history. Meanwhile, Ms. Finch decided on a new high-risk legal strategy. She would petition the court for something more than the standard second test. A simple repeat of the test might just yield the same confusing results if there's something more complex going on, she explained to Alice. We need to argue that given the blood type discrepancy and the conflicting results, we require a more comprehensive form of genetic testing. We need an expert to oversee it. It was a long shot. They would be asking the judge, who was already losing patience, to approve a more expensive, time-consuming process based on what could be dismissed as a simple clerical error. Thorne would paint them as desperate and delusional, throwing Hail Marys to delay the inevitable. They were back in Judge Harrison's chambers a week later. The atmosphere was tense. Thorne immediately went on the attack, accusing Ms. Finch of desperate legal theatrics and abusing the court's time and patience. Ms. Finch remained unruffled. She calmly laid out the evidence. Your Honor, we are not disputing the integrity of the labs. We are questioning the integrity of the samples. We have a medical form signed by Mr. Hayes himself, stating his blood type is O negative. The DNA sample he provided to the petitioner's chosen lab identifies the donor as AB positive. This is a fundamental biological contradiction. It suggests either a mistake of an almost impossible magnitude or, more troublingly, potential fraud. Thorne scoffed. A mistake on a 2-year-old form, Your Honor. That is the crack in the case. It's absurd. But Judge Harrison was listening. He was a stickler for detail, and the contradiction, however small, clearly bothered him. What are you proposing, Ms. Finch? The judge asked, his voice weary but curious. We propose that the court appoint a neutral third-party geneticist to oversee the next sample collection and analysis, she stated clearly. Not just a standard paternity test, but a full genetic sequencing and comparison if necessary to resolve these discrepancies once and for all. We need an expert who can explain to this court why 2 tests could yield 2 different results. We believe the truth is in the science, Your Honor, and we are simply asking for the right scientist to find it. There was a long silence as Judge Harrison considered the request. Alice held her breath, her knuckles white as she gripped the arms of her chair. This was it. If he said no, their fight was over. Mr. Thorne, the judge said, turning to David's lawyer. Your client wants the truth. Ms. Finch is proposing a method to find it definitively. Do you have an objection to ensuring the utmost scientific rigor is applied? Thorne was cornered. To object would make his client look like he had something to hide. He exchanged a quick, tense glance with David. Victoria, sitting just behind the bar this time, gave a barely perceptible shake of her head, her confident facade showing its first hairline crack. No, Your Honor, Thorne said through gritted teeth. We have no objection. My client is confident in the truth and welcomes any and all scrutiny. Judge Harrison nodded. Very well. The motion is granted. I will appoint Dr. Miles Bennett, head of medical genetics at Johns Hopkins, to oversee the process. His findings will be presented to this court, and they will be considered final. We will all get to the bottom of this. As they left the chambers, Alice felt a fragile, unfamiliar feeling rise within her, a glimmer of hope. They had their expert. They had their fighting chance. Ms. Finch had found the crack, and now they were about to bring in a sledgehammer. She still didn't understand what was happening, or what David's game was, but for the first time she felt they were no longer playing on his field. They were about to change the rules of the game entirely. Dr. Miles Bennett was a man who seemed to exist in a world of quiet, intellectual certainty. He had kind eyes, a neatly trimmed gray beard, and an air of academic calm that was instantly reassuring. He met with Alice and Ms. Finch in a small private conference room at the courthouse, his presence a stark contrast to the aggressive posturing they had grown accustomed to. He spoke not in legal jargon, but in the precise, fascinating language of genetics. "This is a most unusual case," he began after reviewing the file containing the 2 contradictory DNA reports and the fertility clinic records. 2 top-tier labs using the same industry-standard STR marker analysis on samples supposedly from the same 2 people yielding results that are polar opposites. It's a statistical unicorn. He first addressed the most obvious theory. "Sample fraud is, of course, a possibility," Dr. Bennett said, looking at Alice with empathy. "It's not unheard of for an individual to have someone else submit a sample on their behalf. The blood type discrepancy between the clinic form and the second lab report certainly points a finger in that direction." So David had someone with AB-positive blood submit a sample for him, Ms. Finch summarized. "But that still doesn't explain our first test, the test that showed he was the father. He must have given his own sample for that one." "Precisely," Dr. Bennett agreed. "Why would a man intent on fraud provide one legitimate sample and one fraudulent one? It's illogical. It suggests a lack of a coherent plan, which seems out of character for the man described in these files." He tented his fingers, his gaze distant. "So we must consider a less common but scientifically plausible alternative. We must entertain this possibility that both lab reports are in their own way correct." Alice and Ms. Finch exchanged a look of bewilderment. "How can they both be correct?" Alice asked. "One says he is the father and one says he isn't." "Let's go back to the beginning," Dr. Bennett said, gently turning his attention to Alice. "Tell me about your IVF journey. Everything you can remember." Alice recounted the painful, hopeful process, the hormone injections, the egg retrieval, and the embryo transfer. She described the clinic, the doctors, and David's role. He had been supportive, she recalled, but also strangely detached at times. She had chalked it up to his discomfort with medical procedures. "He provided his sample at the clinic for the fertilization," Alice confirmed. "I was there. He went into a room and he came out. It was his." Dr. Bennett leaned forward, his focus intense. "And the samples for the 2 paternity tests. The first one for GenTrack was a cheek swab he did at home and mailed in correct." "Yes," Ms. Finch confirmed. "And the second one for the Charleston Forensics Lab was also a cheek swab administered at their facility." "Correct." "And the blood type discrepancy," Dr. Bennett murmured almost to himself. "O negative on a form from years ago, AB positive from the recent cheek swab." He paused, looking directly at Alice. "Mrs. Hayes, has your husband ever had a major medical procedure, a blood transfusion, an organ transplant, specifically a bone marrow transplant?" Alice searched her memory. "No, nothing like that. He's always been very healthy. He broke his leg skiing once years ago. That's it." Dr. Bennett stood up and began to pace the small room, his mind clearly working through a complex puzzle. "There is a rare biological condition," he began, "known as chimerism." He explained it in clear, simple terms. A chimera is an organism that contains cells from 2 or more different individuals, meaning they have 2 sets of DNA. It can happen in a few ways, most commonly when a woman is pregnant with fraternal twins, and one embryo perishes very early on, and its cells are absorbed by the surviving twin. That surviving person can then carry 2 distinct cell lines and 2 distinct DNA profiles for the rest of their life. "So," he continued, "it is theoretically possible for a man to have one DNA profile in his blood and saliva, the cells that would come from a cheek swab, and a completely different DNA profile in other tissues, including his reproductive organs." The room fell silent as the implication of his words settled. You're saying, Ms. Finch began slowly, her eyes wide with understanding, that the DNA in David's saliva could be from his absorbed twin, making it seem like he's not the father, while his reproductive cells carry his own original DNA, which he passed on to his child, Dr. Bennett finished. The IVF procedure used the sperm cells which would carry the correct paternal DNA. The cheek swabs used for the paternity tests used his saliva cells which would carry the other DNA. It would explain everything. It was a staggering concept, something from a science fiction novel, yet Dr. Bennett presented it as a simple, if rare, biological fact. The cheek swab tests would truthfully report that the DNA profile they analyzed is not a match to the child, Dr. Bennett elaborated. They wouldn't be wrong. They would just be testing the wrong part of him. The blood type discrepancy also fits. His O-negative blood type could be his primary one, the one on his medical records, while his saliva and other tissues could carry the AB-positive profile from the secondary cell line. Alice felt a wave of dizziness. It was all so complex, so bizarre, and yet it made a terrifying kind of sense. It was the only theory that accounted for every contradictory piece of evidence. David wasn't just a liar, his own body was a lie. But a crucial question remained. Does David know about this? Alice asked, her voice barely a whisper. Could he have this condition and not be aware of it? It's possible, Dr. Bennett conceded. Many chimeras live their entire lives without knowing. The condition is often only discovered by accident through exactly this kind of paternity dispute or pre-transplant testing. But it doesn't feel like an accident, Ms. Finch said, her voice hard as steel. Victoria's confidence in that courtroom, David's cold certainty. They knew that second test would come back negative. They were counting on it. The pieces began to click into place, forming a picture of deception so profound it was almost psychopathic. David must have discovered his chimerism at some point, maybe during an early medical screening for the IVF process itself that he had hidden from her. He knew a standard paternity test from a cheek swab would prove he wasn't the father. It was the perfect weapon. A scientifically backed lie. He could let Alice get pregnant via IVF, knowing he had a biological escape hatch all along. He had given his real sample for their private test, likely in a moment of panic or confusion, not realizing its purpose, leading to the 99.9% match. But when his lawyer arranged for the second test, the one they planned to use as their bombshell in court, he knew exactly what to do. He provided the cheek swab, confident the result would be 0. He and Victoria hadn't just anticipated the negative result. They had engineered the entire situation around it. Victoria's laughter in the courtroom wasn't just smugness. It was the giddy triumph of a plan perfectly executed. He used his own biology to frame me. Alice said, the horror of it washing over her. Yes, Dr. Bennett said softly. It appears he did. So how do we prove it? Ms. Finch asked, her legal mind already racing ahead. What's the definitive test? We can't use his saliva or his blood, Dr. Bennett explained. We need to test tissue that is likely to only contain his primary cell line. A skin biopsy would work, or more simply, we can test his parents if they are available. Their DNA would show they are the grandparents of your child, which would by extension prove that their son is the father, regardless of what his cheek swab says. But the most direct route, we test the source. We need a new sample from Mr. Hayes, but not a cheek swab. We need the same kind of sample he provided to the fertility clinic. The room was quiet for a moment. We need a court-ordered semen sample, Ms. Finch stated the words hanging in the air. It was an unprecedented, deeply invasive request. But it was the only way to expose the truth that was hiding in David's own cells. Alice felt a cold resolve settle over her. The fight was no longer just about child support or her reputation. It was about revealing a deception so monstrous, so fundamentally twisted, that it had to be brought into the light. David Hayes had used science as his shield. Now they would use it as their sword. The final court hearing felt like the world premiere of a play for which only Alice's side knew the shocking final act. The air in the courtroom was thick with anticipation. Robert Thorne and David Hayes sat at their table, exuding an air of weary confidence, as if they were there to finalize an already won battle. Victoria Vance was back seated in the front row of the gallery, her posture perfect, a small, knowing smile playing on her lips. She looked like a queen surveying her victory. Judge Harrison entered his face an unreadable mask of judicial neutrality. "We are here to hear the findings of the court-appointed expert, Dr. Miles Bennett, regarding the paternity of the child of Mrs. Hayes. Dr. Bennett, you may proceed." Dr. Bennett walked to the witness stand carrying a single thin file. He was sworn in and began to speak, his voice calm and authoritative, a lecturer addressing a captivated class. He started by validating both of the previous DNA reports. "Your Honor," he began, "my investigation concludes that neither Gentrack Diagnostics nor the Charleston Forensics Laboratory made an error. Based on the samples they were given, standard buccal swabs, their conclusions were scientifically sound. Gentrack received a sample that was a 99.999% match. Charleston Forensics received a sample that was a 0% match." Robert Thorne leaned back in his chair, a satisfied smirk on his face. This was going exactly as he'd planned. "However," Dr. Bennett continued, "the discrepancy is not due to lab error or sample tampering in the conventional sense. It is due to a rare biological condition possessed by Mr. David Hayes. Mr. Hayes is a tetragametic chimera." A ripple of confusion went through the courtroom. Judge Harrison leaned forward, his interest clearly piqued. "In English, please, Doctor." "Certainly, Your Honor." Dr. Bennett then gave the same clear, concise explanation he had given to Alice and Ms. Finch. He explained how a person could carry two distinct sets of DNA. He used simple analogies, speaking of two separate instruction manuals existing within one person. Mr. Hayes's saliva and some of his other tissues, including the sample he provided for the second test, carry the DNA of a fraternal twin brother who was absorbed in the womb. His reproductive cells, however, carry his own distinct DNA profile. Thorne was on his feet. "Objection, Your Honor. This is speculative science fiction. There is no proof of this fantastical condition." "On the contrary, Mr. Thorne," Dr. Bennett said calmly, before the judge could even rule, "there is definitive proof." Ms. Finch stood. "Your Honor, pursuant to Dr. Bennett's recommendation, we filed a motion to compel Mr. Hayes to provide a sample identical in nature to the one he provided for the successful IVF treatment. You granted that motion last week under seal." David's face went pale. He shot a panicked look at Thorne, who seemed genuinely caught off guard. Victoria's smile faltered for the first time. "A new sample was collected from Mr. Hayes by Dr. Bennett himself," Ms. Finch continued. "That sample was analyzed, and its DNA was compared to that of the unborn child." Dr. Bennett opened his file. "The DNA from Mr. Hayes's germline cells, his sperm is a completely different profile from the DNA in his saliva. And the germline DNA is a 99.999% match to the fetus. David Hayes is with absolute scientific certainty the biological father of Mrs. Hayes's child." The silence in the courtroom was absolute. It was as if the world had stopped spinning. Then chaos. Thorne began sputtering objections, calling the entire proceeding a circus and an invasion of his client's privacy. But the damage was done. The lie, so carefully constructed, so audacious in its scope, had been shattered by a truth even stranger than fiction. Judge Harrison stared at David, a look of profound disgust on his face. "Mr. Hayes," he said, his voice dangerously low, "did you have prior knowledge of this condition?" David, cornered and exposed, seemed to shrink in his chair. He stammered, I don't... It's a medical thing I didn't understand." But Ms. Finch was not finished. "We have more, Your Honor." She produced another document. "This is a record from a preliminary genetic screening Mr. Hayes underwent a year and a half ago at a private clinic in Atlanta, 6 months before the IVF process began. He told my client it was for a life insurance policy. This report clearly identifies his chimerism. It explicitly warns that standard paternity tests using blood or saliva would likely yield a negative result. He knew. He has known all along." The final piece of the puzzle slammed into place. This was not an accident or a misunderstanding. It was a premeditated, calculated fraud. He had knowingly entered into the IVF process with his wife, all while holding a get-out-of-jail-free card, a biological trump card he planned to play to abandon her and their child. Victoria Vance looked as if she had been struck by lightning. Her face was a mask of utter shock and horror. The plan which she had thought was so clever was not just a failure. It was a public spectacle of their own monstrous deception. The smug laughter she had directed at Alice now seemed like a grotesque prelude to her own downfall. She stared at David not with love or support, but with the dawning, furious realization that his web of lies was far more complex than she had ever imagined, and she was now caught in it with him. Judge Harrison banged his gavel, his face a thundercloud of fury. "Mr. Hayes, Mr. Thorne, I suggest you sit down before I hold you both in contempt. Of all the cynical, manipulative, and cruel tactics I have seen in my 20 years on this bench, this is by far the most reprehensible. To use one's own unique biology as a tool for such a profound and calculated deceit against one's wife and unborn child is beyond the pale." He looked at the evidence, then at Alice, his expression softening for the first time into one of deep respect and sympathy. "The court finds the expert testimony of Dr. Bennett to be conclusive," he declared, his voice ringing with finality. "Paternity is established. Mr. David Hayes is the legal and biological father. All motions by the petitioner are dismissed. I will be ruling in favor of Mrs. Hayes on all matters of support, and I can assure you, Ms. Finch, I will be taking Mr. Hayes's egregious conduct into severe consideration when determining the final settlement. His attempt to commit fraud upon this court will be dealt with separately and with the appropriate gravity." He banged the gavel one last time. "This hearing is adjourned." It was over. Alice sat stunned, the wave of vindication so powerful it left her breathless. Ms. Finch squeezed her hand, her own eyes shining with triumph. Across the room, David Hayes sat with his head in his hands, a broken man, his intricate deception dismantled piece by piece in front of the world. Victoria stood up abruptly and walked out of the courtroom without a single backward glance, her face a mask of cold fury. The partnership, it seemed, was dissolved. Alice had walked into the legal battle armed with a simple truth. She had been met with a lie so complex it was woven into her husband's very DNA. But in the end, the full, unvarnished, and bizarre truth had come out, and it had set her free. The aftermath of the verdict was swift and brutal for David Hayes. The court awarded Alice a settlement that reflected the depth of his deception, giving her the house significant support and financial security. His attempt to commit fraud led to a criminal investigation, and the public scandal cost him his career and his partnership with Victoria, which dissolved into bitter accusations. The empire he and his mistress had planned was now rubble, and he became a pariah in the city he once commanded. For Alice, victory tasted of peace. She reclaimed her home and her life, finding strength in her hard-won independence. A few weeks later, she gave birth to a healthy baby boy, naming him Ethan, a name that meant strong. Holding him for the first time, she felt a love so fierce it erased the shadows of the past. Her life found a new, quiet rhythm, filled with the simple joys of motherhood and a slow return to her own career. David was a footnote in her story now. No longer a prisoner in a gilded cage, Alice was a free woman, embracing a new dawn she had won for herself and her son. Alice's story is a powerful reminder that the fight for truth is often a fight for one's own sanity. It wasn't just about a courtroom battle. It was about reclaiming her narrative from the gaslighting and profound deceit of the two people she should have been able to trust the most. She faced public humiliation and impossible odds, armed with nothing but a mother's instinct and the courage to demand answers when the science itself seemed to lie. Her victory was not just legal, but personal, a reclamation of her dignity and her strength. The incredible twist of genetic chimerism shows that sometimes reality is far stranger and more complex than any fiction. What do you think you would have done in her position? Could you have been as resilient as Alice? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. If her incredible story of courage and resilience moved you, please hit that like button. Share it with someone who needs to see the power of perseverance, and don't forget to subscribe for more unbelievable true stories that prove the truth is always worth fighting for.